Somewhere beneath this water, there used to be a forest, not of trees, but of grass. Hydrilla, eelgrass, and peppergrass once carpeted more than 50,000 acres of this lake bottom, filtering light, sheltering baitfish, and feeding a bass population that drew anglers from every corner of the country. Today, that underwater forest is gone. Nearly all of it. And with it, the fishery that once defined bass fishing in America. This is not a story about a single lake. It is a story unfolding across the United States, from the shallow waters of Central Florida to the famed reservoirs of Alabama and beyond. The lakes are still here, but something essential inside them is disappearing. To understand what is happening to America's bass fisheries, it helps to understand one fundamental truth of freshwater ecology. Aquatic vegetation is not decoration. It is infrastructure. Submerged plants like hydrilla, eelgrass, and bulrush form the structural backbone of a healthy lake. They filter sediment, oxygenate water, stabilize the lake bottom, and create the complex habitat that sustains every link in the food chain, from zooplankton and macroinvertebrates to juvenile bluegill, threadfin shad, and the largemouth bass that sit at the top. For largemouth bass, vegetation is not merely preferred habitat. It is survival. Young bass depend on submerged plants for cover from predators. Adults use grass edges and weed mats as ambush points. Spawning requires firm, clean substrate, the kind that healthy vegetation helps maintain by trapping sediment and preventing the buildup of organic muck. When the grass goes, the bass don't simply relocate. The entire system that produces them begins to collapse. Recreational fishing generates more than $230 billion in economic output for the American economy each year and supports over 1 million jobs. More than 50 million Americans fish annually, and roughly half of them target bass. The largemouth is the most popular freshwater game fish in the nation, and the lakes that produce it are economic engines for entire communities, fueling diet services, tackle shops, marinas, hotels, and restaurants in towns where the bass are often the main attraction. The health of these fisheries is not an abstract environmental concern. It is an economic lifeline. And in state after state, that lifeline is being severed by the systematic removal of the one thing bass need most. This is the story of how aquatic vegetation loss is silently killing America's best bass fisheries. And it begins in Florida. Hello my friends, welcome to American Fishing Atlas. Subscribe to the channel, share and like. Thank you. The rise of Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee. 730 square miles of shallow, subtropical water in the heart of South Florida, the largest lake in the state, and one of the largest by surface area in the entire country outside the Great Lakes. With an average depth of just 9 feet, Okeechobee is essentially an enormous shallow basin, warmed by the Florida sun and historically rich with submerged aquatic vegetation. For decades, it was considered the bass fishing capital of the United States. Professional tournament trails returned to its waters year after year. Guides ran boats out of Clewiston, Okeechobee City, and Belle Glade, booking clients months in advance. Trophy bass, 8, 10, 12 pounds, came from its grass flats with a regularity that seemed permanent. In 2009, submerged aquatic vegetation on Lake Okeechobee peaked at more than 50,000 acres. Eelgrass, bulrush, and hydrilla covered the nearshore zone in a living carpet that filtered the water, stabilized the bottom, and provided the foundation for one of the most productive bass fisheries in North America. The decline? Then the vegetation began to disappear. A combination of factors converged. High water levels, driven by flood control operations and hurricane events, kept the lake elevated above its ecological envelope for extended periods, reducing the sunlight reaching the bottom and smothering plant growth. Hurricanes Irma in 2017 and later Ian and Nicole resuspended massive volumes of sediment into the water column, uprooting vegetation and blocking the light plants needed to photosynthesize. By 2023, submerged aquatic vegetation on Lake Okeechobee had plummeted to an all-time low of roughly 2,500 acres. The restoration target, the amount scientists say the lake needs for a functioning ecosystem, is 40,000. The fishery responded exactly as ecology would predict. Between 2014 and 2019, largemouth bass catch rates on Lake Okeechobee declined by 76%. Tournament weights became a fraction of what they had been a decade earlier. Guides who had built careers on the lake watched their bookings evaporate alongside the grass. The spring question. But high water and hurricanes are only part of the story. For decades, the state of Florida has relied on chemical herbicides as its primary tool for managing invasive aquatic plants. Hydrilla, originally introduced to Florida waters in the early 1950s, when an aquarium dealer near Tampa dumped a shipment of plants from Sri Lanka into a local canal, had spread throughout the state by the 1970s. It grew aggressively, sometimes more than an inch a day, clogging waterways, choking irrigation canals, and impeding navigation. The state needed a solution. Herbicide spraying became that solution. It was cheap. It was fast. One crew could treat 10 acres a day, compared to half an acre for a mechanical harvester. State agencies, water management districts, and the Army Corps of Engineers contracted private applicators to spray lakes across Florida with compounds including glyphosate, 2,4-D, and diquat-dibromide. The goal was maintenance control, keeping invasive species in check so waterways remain navigable and usable. The critical difference between mechanical removal and chemical treatment is what happens to the dead vegetation. A harvester lifts plant material out of the water. Herbicide kills it in place. And when thousands of acres of plant matter die simultaneously and sink to the bottom, they decompose. That decomposition creates muck, a thick layer of organic sediment that blankets the lake floor. Muck does not support new plant growth. It increases turbidity. It releases nutrients that fuel algal blooms. And when those blooms die, their decomposition further depletes oxygen. The cycle feeds itself. The spraying that was meant to manage vegetation began, in many anglers' eyes, to destroy the very ecosystems it was supposed to protect. In late 2018, public pressure from anglers, waterfowl hunters, and conservation groups forced the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to pause all aquatic herbicide treatments and host public meetings across the state. The message from stakeholders was consistent and urgent. The blanket spraying had to stop. But the structural damage, decades of accumulated muck, lost seed banks, degraded water clarity, could not be undone with a policy change alone. The Harris Chain, a pattern repeated. Lake Okeechobee was not alone. 100 miles to the north, the Harris Chain of lakes told a parallel story. Comprising 8 primary lakes and roughly 75,000 acres in Lake and Orange counties, the Harris Chain once hosted some of the most prestigious bass tournaments in the country, including the BSS Megabucks. Then, around 1990, a national tournament on the chain set a record that no one wanted, the lowest average catch rate of any national event in the organization's history. A major fishing publication documented what had gone wrong. Among the causes cited were overzealous weed spraying and the degradation of the aquatic habitat that bass depended on. The Harris Chain has since experienced a partial recovery. A severe drought in 2001 and 2002 created a natural drawdown that allowed eelgrass, lily pads, and shoreline cover to regrow. Local organizations and state agencies replanted native vegetation. Hydrilla, despite its invasive status, returned in places like Lake Apopka, once nicknamed the Dead Sea after decades of agricultural pollution, and contributed to improving water clarity and fish habitat. But the tension between managing invasive vegetation and preserving the habitat base need has never been fully resolved. Spraying continues on the chain, and anglers continue to push back. 30 miles southeast of the Harris Chain, just minutes from Walt Disney World, sits a lake that tells a fundamentally different story. Lake Tohopekaliga, known to locals as Lake Toho, covers roughly 22,000 acres in Osceola County. Its name comes from the Seminole language, meaning, "We will gather together here." And for bass anglers, the gathering has been extraordinary. In January of 2001, during a Bassmaster Elite Series event on Lake Toho, professional angler Dean Rojas weighed a 5-bass limit of 45 pounds, 2 ounces, an average of more than 9 pounds per fish. It remains the heaviest 5-bass limit in BSS history. During that same 4-day tournament, 21 bass weighing more than 10 pounds crossed the scales. 2¼ tons of largemouth bass were weighed in total. The fishing world had never seen anything like it. What makes Lake Toho remarkable is not just the quality of its fishing. It is the management philosophy that sustains it. While much of Florida's lake management has leaned heavily on herbicide spraying, Toho has benefited from a different approach, one centered on controlled drawdowns and mechanical habitat restoration. The drawdown method. In the spring of 2004, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission executed an extreme drawdown and habitat enhancement project on Lake Toho. The concept was elegant in its simplicity: lower the water level dramatically, expose the degraded shoreline, and physically remove the accumulated muck and invasive vegetation that had choked the littoral zone. Over the course of the project, contractors removed 8.4 million cubic yards of organic material and noxious plant growth from more than 3,500 acres of lake bottom. Bulldozers scraped away decades of sediment, revealing the hard, sandy substrate underneath, the kind of bottom that bays need for spawning. After the scraping, native vegetation was replanted. Kissimmee grass, duck potato, spickerish, and eelgrass were introduced to restored areas. The principle was straightforward. Rather than spraying the lake and leaving dead plant matter to decompose in place, physically remove the problem material and re-establish the native plant community from the ground up. The results spoke for themselves. Within a few years of the restoration, Lake Toho was producing trophy bass at a level that rivaled or exceeded its pre-decline numbers. Bassmaster magazine would later call it the most consistent lake in the country for producing both numbers and trophy-size bass. Professional circuits returned. Guide services flourished. The local economy in Kissimmee and St. Cloud benefited directly. On nearby East Lake Tohopekaliga, a similar drawdown project begun in 2019 has shown the same promising results. FWC biologists have documented bass, bluegill, and red deer sunfish using restored areas for spawning. Native vegetation, pondweed, eelgrass, spickerish, and water lily has regrown naturally in the restoration zones. 46,000 Kissimmee grass plants and 30,000 duck potato plants were added to accelerate recovery. Why it works? The drawdown method succeeds because it addresses the root cause, not just the symptom. Herbicide spraying removes visible vegetation, but leaves the organic material in the water to decompose and form muck. Over time, that muck layer deepens, blocking light, preventing new plant growth, and degrading spawning substrate. The problem compounds. Each round of spraying adds another layer to the bottom. Mechanical removal, whether through drawdowns with bulldozers or through floating harvesters that cut and extract vegetation, takes the biomass out of the system entirely. The nutrients locked in that plant material leave the lake. The bottom is exposed to sunlight. Native plants, which have lower nutrient requirements than invasive species, can reestablish. The lake begins to heal from the substrate up rather than from the surface down. The contrast between Lake Okeechobee and Lake Toho is not subtle. One lake has been managed primarily through chemical treatments and flood control operations that kept water levels chronically elevated. The other has been managed through periodic physical restoration that prioritizes the health of the littoral zone. One has seen its submerged vegetation drop to a fraction of what it needs. The other continues to produce some of the finest bass fishing in the world. The tension between vegetation management and fishery health is not unique to Florida. Across the southeastern United States and beyond, the same conflict plays out wherever aquatic plants grow thick enough to inconvenience boaters, waterfront property owners, or municipal water systems. Lake Guntersville in northern Alabama, a 69,000-acre Tennessee Valley Authority impoundment stretching 75 miles along the Tennessee River, has been called the Big Bass capital of Alabama and has been voted the #1 largemouth bass lake in the country by Bassmaster magazine. Its fame rests almost entirely on its aquatic vegetation. Hydrilla and milfoil create vast underwater meadows that harbor enormous populations of bass, bluegill, and shad. Anglers travel from across the nation for the chance at a double-digit largemouth exploding on a topwater bait over a grass mat. But Guntersville, too, faces the spraying question. The TVA manages aquatic plants on the reservoir using both herbicides and mechanical harvesters, treating areas around public ramps, beaches, parks, and residential shoreline. The economic pressure to keep waterways open for recreation and property access is real. Boaters want clear channels. Homeowners want accessible docks. The demands of a lake shared by diverse user groups create inherent tension with the biological requirements of a world-class bass fishery. What separates Guntersville's current situation from Okeechobee's crisis is largely one of degree. The TVA's approach has generally maintained moderate vegetation coverage rather than pursuing broad-scale eradication. The fishery has remained productive. But anglers and biologists alike understand that the balance is precarious. One policy shift, one decision to prioritize navigation or property access over habitat, and the same cascade that ravaged Florida's lakes could begin. The political equation. At its core, this is a political problem as much as an ecological one. Waterfront property owners pay taxes and vote. Boating interests generate economic activity and lobby for open navigation. Water utilities need unimpeded flow. These are legitimate concerns. But when herbicide spraying becomes the default tool, the cheapest, fastest, most politically expedient option, the long-term costs are borne by the ecosystem and, by extension, by the fishing communities that depend on it. The economics of herbicide dependency are revealing. Florida spends roughly $15 million annually on hydrilla management alone. Nationally, aquatic plant management runs into the hundreds of millions. Yet these expenditures address the symptom, visible vegetation, rather than the underlying conditions that cause invasive species to thrive. Nutrient-loaded runoff from agriculture and development, altered hydrology from flood control infrastructure, and the absence of the natural water level fluctuations that historically kept plant communities in balance. Meanwhile, the economic value of what is being lost dwarfs the cost of managing it differently. The American Sport Fishing Association reports that recreational fishing generates more than $230 billion annually for the national economy and supports over 1 million jobs. Bass fishing alone accounts for a disproportionate share of that figure. When a lake like Okeechobee or a chain like Harris declines, the ripple effects reach every business in the surrounding community, from the bait shop to the hotel to the restaurant where tournament anglers eat dinner. The guides on Lake Okeechobee understand this arithmetic intimately. Business has slowed. Bookings have dropped. Some have moved to other lakes. The communities around the Big Lake, Clewiston, Okeechobee, Moore Haven, feel the absence of the anglers who once came by the thousands. Recovery operations. There are signs of hope. In December of 2024, the United States Army Corps of Engineers initiated recovery operations on Lake Okeechobee, a deliberate drawdown aimed at lowering the lake below 12 feet above sea level and holding it there long enough for sunlight to reach the bottom and trigger the regrowth of submerged aquatic vegetation. The goal is 90 consecutive days below 12 feet, or 60 days below 11.5. It is, in effect, an attempt to mimic what happened naturally on Lake Tahoe, to reset the system. Early indications have been cautiously encouraging. On the west side of the lake and along the north shore, water clarity has improved to the point where the bottom is visible from the surface in many areas. Anglers have reported better fishing, more bass in the shallows, more structure to target, the first real signs of recovery in years. But advocates warn that the window is fragile. If the lake rises too quickly before new vegetation can establish, or if herbicide spraying resumes in recovering areas, the progress could be lost. The lesson emerging from Florida's experience, reinforced by the contrast between its managed and mismanaged lakes, is that aquatic vegetation in America's base waters cannot be treated as a nuisance to be eliminated. It must be managed as the critical ecological infrastructure that it is. This means transitioning from blanket herbicide programs to targeted, integrated management strategies. It means investing in mechanical harvesting for navigation channels and dock access while preserving the vegetation that sustains the fishery. It means planning water levels to benefit the littoral zone during critical growing windows. It means reducing the nutrient pollution from agricultural and urban runoff that fuels invasive plant growth in the first place. And it means listening to the people who know these waters best, the anglers, guides, and biologists who have watched the decline unfold in real time and have been sounding the alarm for years. Organizations like Anglers for Lake Okeechobee, Captains for Clean Water, and the Mighty River Recovery Project on the St. Johns River are leading that charge, pushing for policy reforms, funding independent water quality testing, and advocating for alternatives to the chemical dependence that has defined Florida's aquatic plant management for decades. The stakes extend far beyond fishing. Submerged aquatic vegetation is the lake's natural filtration system. When it disappears, the water quality problems that affect downstream communities, algal blooms in the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries, toxic blue-green algae in drinking water sources, ecological collapse in the Everglades, intensify. The health of the vegetation and the health of the broader watershed are inseparable. Lake Guntersville still has its grass. Lake Tahoe still has its base. But Lake Okeechobee is a warning of what happens when the balance tips too far, when short-term management decisions accumulate into long-term ecological damage that takes decades to reverse. Somewhere beneath the surface of Lake Okeechobee, the process is beginning again. Slowly. In scattered patches, where the water has cleared and the sun reaches the bottom, new shoots of eelgrass are emerging from seed banks that have lain dormant through years of darkness. It is not yet recovery. It is possibility. America's base waters did not decline overnight. They declined one spray pass at a time, one high water season at a time, one political decision at a time. The lakes are still here. The fish, in reduced numbers, still hold in whatever structure remains. And the people who love these waters, who have built lives and livelihoods around them, are still fighting. The question is whether the country that invented modern bass fishing will protect the places that made it possible. Whether the vegetation that sustains these fisheries will be managed as the irreplaceable foundation it is, or treated as an obstacle to be sprayed away. The lakes are listening. The answer will determine what remains.